Former Republican presidential nominee Mitt Romney recently unveiled his plan to give a $1,000 cash payment to American citizens in response to the coronavirus pandemic. Now, this is a really big deal, and not just because it's a $1,000 cash payment, but also because it looks a lot more like some of the proposals which we've been seeing from the Democratic side, from the progressive side of the Democratic Party in response to the pandemic, with one major difference. Mitt Romney's plan as proposed here is a one-time cash payment of $1,000, whereas on the progressive side, we've been seeing much more of a UBI-like response, which is to say we give a $1,000 or how much ever it ends up being monthly or however often payment to workers until this crisis is over. So that's obviously one really big difference here. But I want to show you a quote from this article. Actually, I'll show you two quotes from this article, which I think are really, really telling. First quote here is from Mitt Romney. "We also urgently need to build on this legislation," referring to the legislation passed by House Democrats and Nancy Pelosi. We need to build on that legislation with additional help to help families and small businesses meet their short-term financial obligations, ease the financial burden of students entering the workforce, and protect healthcare workers on the front line. So really, really interesting. And the second quote I want to show you here is from Senator Tom Cotton. Tom Cotton says, "I don't think the House bill will pass the Senate as it's written for one basic problem. It doesn't go far enough, and it doesn't go fast enough. There are too many gaps in coverage for the smallest businesses and medium-sized businesses." Republicans out here hitting Democrats from the left. That's what's happening here. Now, I do want to say here, Tom Cotton is one of those Republicans who, if you watch Rising, if you know who Saagar Enjeti is, Saagar Enjeti has said that he really likes Tom Cotton, although he has criticized him a few times. And I will say, even myself, just as a progressive myself, as far as GOP senators go, Tom Cotton isn't the worst. That's not to say I'm a fan of him, but he isn't, Mitch McConnell's much worse. I'll just say that. And then, of course, the article concludes with its, praising of Andrew Yang here. He says that they say the concept of a regular direct cash payment for every American adult, regardless of income level, was a major proposal of former Democratic presidential candidate Andrew Yang. Now, obviously, again, Mitt Romney's plan is not a UBI plan, but that's clearly where the $1,000 number seems to have come from. I mean, we all sort of remember that. Now, AOC out here recently also saying a similar thing, talking about UBI, saying right now it would be a great time to weigh emergency measures such as extending Medicare and Medicaid coverage to all eviction freezes, no strings attached UBI program, eliminating work requirements, etc., etc. So basically, UBI is in there, some sort of cash payment. Now, the reason, by the way, why this is why there's a connection here, even though Mitt Romney's plan is not a UBI plan, is that it differs from the typical response, which is to say the typical response of Republicans would be a tax cut, and that's something which Donald Trump has talked a little bit about recently. But the idea of giving money directly to workers seems like it would be a left-wing proposal, but under emergency situations, under this situation, even Mitt Romney and even, as we saw, Tom Cotton, and actually a number of Republicans have now come out and say that they would be, at least in some sense, supportive of that kind of response. Now, AOC also sort of preemptively, actually I shouldn't say this is preemptively because this is afterwards, but also responding to some of the criticisms here, says, "Be careful with UBI proposals you see popping up. They are not all created equal, and they can have large macroeconomic and inflationary and systemic effects. Proposals should be weighed as part of a larger policy mix, including payment suspensions, et cetera, et cetera." Part of that is also responding because AOC actually got a lot of criticism saying that, UBI is a Trojan horse right-wing measure in order to gut the safety net. And AOC sort of has been responding to some of that, saying, look, my proposal, what I want when I talk about UBI is to build on top of the safety net. It's not a UBI in place of the safety net. So that's sort of where some of that is coming from. And also, she's just in general, saying be careful, talking about possibly Mitt Romney's plan, et cetera, et cetera. So, and also, by the way, MSNBC host Chris Hayes saying right now a $1,000 per American U.S. citizen would cost about $330 billion a month, do it for 3 months while economic life is disrupted, and you come right at about $1 trillion. Doesn't solve everything, but would be straightforward and progressive in its impact. So we've been seeing a number of people talking about UBI more recently, some kind of cash payment in response to this absolute pandemic, absolute crisis, which is now expanding into an economic crisis. If you look at the stock market, things are completely falling off a cliff. And I have been seeing people on my Facebook feed talking about how they're getting laid off. People I know, people I went to high school with, one person I went to middle school with, talking about how they got laid off of their job now that things seem to be going south. So I do think that this is something that is picking up. We're not necessarily seeing it in the statistics yet, but the fact that I know people, multiple people now, who have been laid off since this whole thing started a few days ago, suggests that yes, this thing could be really, really big, and we're going to need to have a significant kind of response. Now, why is this such a big deal here? This is why right here. So coming here from here, we say most Republicans are going to hit Democrats from the left. Takes are often fan fiction, but this is now really happening. So congratulations, Nancy Pelosi, for getting outflanked. I mean, as I was saying, Nancy Pelosi gave us a half measure with this paid sick leave, which isn't really paid sick leave because the majority of workers aren't even covered in the paid sick leave, and it is something which would just burden businesses in the way that it's written. So, while you might be able to do that in a, sort of in a good time, or a measure which you might be able to pass if it's something which businesses can always expect, doing it right now in an emergency crisis is actually really, really just bad, not just bad politics, but also just bad economically, and it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. You have to write that kind of legislation really, really carefully, and it does have to be essentially a subsidy for business at this point. Now, we can criticize how business is structured, that it shouldn't be this way, et cetera, but how it is right now, if we're talking about protecting workers for the next coming months, it has to look different than the way that the House Democrats have structured it right now. And so, I mean, you can see these tweets here again. Tom Cotton saying the House bill sets up a complicated relief system that relies on paid sick leave and refundable tax credits that won't move quickly enough and puts undue pressure on businesses to lay off workers. We don't want to see layoffs. We need cash in the hands of affected families. And then also here, just talking about Mitt Romney's proposal here of $1,000 during it. And then, of course, Brianna Joy Gray also saying, I'm old enough to remember 2016, so I don't think that the take that Republicans are going to hit Democrats from the left takes are fan fiction, but that is what's happening, and it's only going to get worse if status quo Biden is the nominee. And this is why this is such a big deal, because that's what they did in 2016. Donald Trump talked about giving $1 trillion, or was it $2 trillion in terms of infrastructure investment. And he had a lot of takes which seemed to be left-wing, a lot of sort of maneuvers which appeared to be left-wing, which, then when he came into office, he didn't really do. He just let status quo Republicans just run the agenda. But on the campaign trail, Donald Trump was running as a populist, running as someone who might hit the Democrats on the left on some issues. And so it was, really, really interesting at the time, again, as he's governed, that isn't what's happened. He hasn't done that at all. But when he was on the campaign trail, he was talking a lot of left-wing stuff he even at one point, by the way, on the campaign trail, he was talking about how he wanted to guarantee universal health care to everybody, which actually historically, you can find clips of Donald Trump in like the early 2000s and in the 90s and in the 80s saying that he supports, a universal health care system like Canada. So this is actually something that Donald Trump has supported for a really, really long time. Now that he's in office, he doesn't support it. But historically, for years and years, decades, actually, he did actually support like a Canadian style healthcare system, even though he was right wing on sort of immigration and a lot of other things. So, but anyway, that's just sort of an aside. And this is what I do think is really, really interesting, because it is very much so very possible that the Republicans are trying to now hit the Democrats on the left in order to, try to, get off some of the left flank, or at the very least, motivate some left-wing voters to stay home if they are not necessarily excited to vote for Joe Biden. And then they're like, well, the Republicans are doing a good job responding to the pandemic and some of the proposals are left wing. So, you know what? I'm not energized enough. I'm not mad enough at what the Republicans are doing to motivate myself to vote for someone who I'm not necessarily a great fan of anyway. Because that's the thing, guys. The Republicans don't actually need to convince lefty voters, convince Bernie supporters, convince Democratic voters to vote for them. That's not what they need to do. They just need to convince the left that they're not terrible. That's all Donald Trump. That's all the Republicans need to do in order to win the election. They don't need to persuade them to vote for him. They just need to persuade them to stay home. So and again, I've talked about my views when it comes to how I'm going to vote and how I'm looking at this election. And I will say this, a few days ago, actually, maybe like a week and a half ago, I would have said, look, if you're going to nominate Joe Biden, he's absolutely going to lose this thing because, he's status quo Joe. He doesn't energize people. He doesn't excite people. He's definitely going to lose, especially now that Trump has the incumbency advantage. Well, with this coronavirus pandemic, honestly, even Joe Biden, even status quo Joe might be able to stumble his way into the presidency because, especially as we're seeing it right now, Donald Trump is not in any way doing a good job handling this thing. Although we have seen in the past 24, maybe 48 hours, Donald Trump pivoting a little bit before he was saying, oh, well, just wait a couple weeks and then poof, it'll all go away. This whole thing will be gone. But now, at least Donald Trump is acknowledging the facts. He's acknowledging that this thing is going to be pretty bad. And, he's talking about, proposals and how we can, move forward, et cetera, because I think at this point he's realized that, look, my reelection is going to hinge on how I respond to this pandemic because this pandemic is real. So, we are starting to see a lot more coming out of Donald Trump, coming out of the Republicans in response to this. And we're going to have to see how this thing goes. But I do also just want to say real quick before I go on to the next thing, which is that if Bernie Sanders loses this thing, we lost a really big opportunity to do a really big change. Because what's the thing they always say? They always say, well, first of all, Bernie Sanders, you're unelectable. But then the second thing they say is, even if you do win, you're not going to be able to get anything done, which, by the way, just masks the fact that it's not about getting things done with Republicans. It's also the fact that Democrats who pretend to agree with you are also going to try to block you, going to try to stop you because they don't actually agree with you, even though they pretend to, right? So that's what that thing masks there. But they always say you're not going to be able to get it done. Well, here's the thing, guys. If this pandemic ends up being as bad as they say it's going to be right now, and it really does look that way when you go to the supermarket right now, if it really ends up being that bad, I actually do think we would have the political capital to really make massive reforms to our healthcare system. Massive reforms. And, especially, you turn around, you make the case how Medicare for all would have been able to prevent or at least substantially, sort of lower the curve or whatever they're saying right now. Right? You make that case. You really might have been able to make some serious inroads to public opinion. And you really might have been able, like what I'm saying is Democrats, if they win this time and, the coronavirus pandemic is as bad as it seems like it's going to be, they're going to have a lot of political capital. And why waste it doing mealy-mouthed, halfway centrist proposals as Joe Biden seems to be doing? Which, by the way, is another reason why I'm actually really happy that Bernie Sanders is staying in the race right now. Because, one of the things which we're seeing, we're going to have to see what Bernie Sanders does in the coming days, weeks, months, etc. But one of the things which a lot of the centrist Democrats are calling on Bernie Sanders to do right now is just to drop out because it looks like he's lost, et cetera. Guys, Bernie Sanders has the ability to bring Joe Biden to the left. That is what really matters, because if Joe Biden wins, then he is going to have a serious opportunity to make actual change because he's going to have the political capital to do it. Now, if he loses, which basically, in my mind, if he loses, that means that the pandemic wasn't as bad as they're saying, which I do think it's going to be pretty bad. It seems pretty clear at this point that it's going to be, right? But if he wins, that means that the pandemic was probably pretty bad. Because, by the way, if you look at all the metrics, not including the pandemic, Donald Trump was on track to win re-election. He just was. When you look at sort of the metrics in terms of the economy, you look at historical trend lines, you look at approval ratings, he was likely on track to win re-election. He just was. That's just, maybe that would have not been the case, but it looked like that was going to happen. And nominating Joe Biden with his, mental concerns, et cetera, I do think that he would have lost re-election. So Anyway, my point is Joe Biden is going to have a chance to make real inroads, make real changes if he wins this thing. So Bernie Sanders bringing him to left, good thing, good thing. Now, the other thing I want to talk about here is, so this is Orrin Cass. Now, Orrin Cass is someone who has been a critic of universal basic income, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But one of the things he's saying now, a critic of UBI is saying, well, look, well, I'll just read it. So, as a particularly outspoken critic of universal basic income, I would emphasize direct cash payments are the correct policy in this crisis and have nothing to do with UBI, whose entire premise and its greatest flaw is you know in advance that you will be receiving it in perpetuity. Now, I don't necessarily agree with his criticism. His criticism, and I've read a little bit about it because I've actually studied UBI myself. His criticism is essentially to say that, when you look at all the studies of universal basic income, when you look at, how the studies are conducted, these people, get the UBI and they know it's going to end. And so the studies don't necessarily line up to reality where they know they're going to be getting the money in the long run. And so, yes, people are going to save, people are going to invest when it comes to the studies because they know it's a short-term payment as opposed to, a kind of long-term thing which they can depend on, they can rely on. And so he thinks that if you can have a payment which you can rely on, like UBI, and everybody gets it, it's going to sap the work ethic, sort of sap entrepreneurial spirit. Now, personally, I don't necessarily agree with that argument because when you consider it, it's a little bit suspicious of an argument to make, considering that the argument that the pro-capitalists make all the time is that what happens when capitalism, does its thing, they say. Well, entrepreneurialism means that rising tide lifts all boats. But if a rising tide lifts all boats, then you would expect that people would at some point decide, hey, you know what? I'm not going to work anymore because now my financial situation is good enough. Turns out that doesn't happen. Why? Because people make relative comparisons to other people in terms of how well off they are, as opposed to absolute ones. So if, consider, for instance, in 1950, the average standard of living, the average amount of sort of stuff that people could buy was a lot less than it is now. But people aren't really any less entrepreneurial than they were back then. People don't necessarily have any kind of a lower work ethic. And that's because everybody went up, right? Because you compare yourself in a local sort of comparison to other people. And so if the inequality is the same, if everybody is going up, then there's no reason to think that people would become less entrepreneurial because people are still ambitious in the same way, right? So, you raise the sort of bottom end of things. That doesn't mean that people become less ambitious, less, it doesn't lower their work ethic any. So anyway, so I always actually find that to be a little bit of a weird criticism of UBI because it seems like the very thing which they turn around and say is that, capitalism, the fact that capitalism motivates people to work means that you have a rising tide which lift all boats. So wouldn't that, by your own premises, mean that capitalism would eventually destroy its own work ethic? But clearly they don't seem to think that. So anyway, maybe I don't understand his argument entirely, but I have read quite a bit of it, but that seems to be sort of his take on it. Personally, my view on UBI, I actually do like the idea of UBI, but I do not like it the way where it sort of guts social safety nets, where it guts entitlement programs and the like. So anyway, it's a really interesting debate which we're having right now about UBI. It's a really interesting discussion which we're having about cash payments, and it's really, really interesting about whether or not Republicans are gonna try to hit us from the left. What's going to happen? How will Donald Trump respond? We'll have to see. One thing is clear though, right? They always say there are no atheists in foxholes. Clearly, there are no free marketers in pandemics either. Anyway.